Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Baldassare, and I'm the president and director of the PPIC Statewide Survey at the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome. Welcome to you, and thank you for joining today's virtual program on PPIC's latest statewide survey. This is part of the Californians and their Government series, and this survey is funded with special thanks to the R.J. and Frances Miller Foundation, the James Irvine Foundation, and the PPIC Donor Circle. Without their support, this survey wouldn't be possible, so we want to acknowledge that and thank them very much for their support. For today's program, you're going to be hearing from my colleague, Rachel Lawler, who will walk you through some of the key findings of the survey. After her presentation, I'll share some of my takeaways, and then my favorite part will be to answer some questions from you in the audience. So please ask some questions. If you have a question, please send an email to the email address on the screen, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com, ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you. We'd appreciate if you could include your name and the organization that you're affiliated with, along with your question. And we'll try to get to all the questions that we can at the end of the program. It's now my great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Rachel Lawler, who is a research associate at PPIC. And Rachel was the project leader for this survey. And I thank Rachel for joining us this morning and for all the work that you did in putting this survey together. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Mark, and thank you all for joining us today and for your interest in this work. Just give me a moment and I will bring up our presentation. Great, so thanks so much, Mark, again, for that lovely introduction. And before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge my co-authors on this report, which obviously includes Mark, as well as Dean Bonner and Alyssa Dykeman. And as Mark mentioned, this survey is part of our Californians and their Government series, which has covered numerous state and national issues since 1999. And for those of you who might be joining us for the first time and are unfamiliar with the PPIC statewide survey, its mission is to provide timely, relevant, nonpartisan data on political, social, and economic opinions, which we hope will be used to help inform and improve state policymaking, raise awareness, and also encourage discussion. The PPIC survey covers public perceptions, attitudes, and policy preferences, as well as ballot choices on both state and national races. Since the start of the survey in 1998, PPIC has provided a voice for over 360,000 Californians on more than 180 general, issue-specific, and regional surveys. This survey was conducted from May 17th through 26th using telephone interviews, 75% of which were conducted on cell phones and 25% of which were conducted on landlines. The interviews were conducted in both English and Spanish, according to the respondents' preferences. Our sample includes over 1,700 California adults and 1,048 of those respondents who we have identified as likely voters. The margin of error is 3.5% for all adults and 4.6% for likely voters. In the full report, which focuses on, or you can find on the PPIC website, we have two main sections. The first section focuses on state issues, and the second section looks at national issues. So we're going to start our presentation today looking at some findings on state issues. So looking first at approval ratings for our state elected officials, at 65% among all adults and 64% among likely voters, Governor Newsom's approval rating is the highest since he took office in January of last year. And for some context, the last time we measured an approval level for a governor that was this high was 65% for Governor Schwarzenegger in August of 2004. At 86%, Democrats are far more likely than independents at 49% and Republicans at 27% to say they approve. And today, majorities across the state's regions, as well as majorities across all demographic groups, approve. In terms of the California legislature, 56% of adults and 50% of likely voters approve. And approval ratings were similar in February. Today, 70% of Democrats approve compared to 39% of Republicans and 39% of independents and 23% of Republicans. About 6 in 10 across regions approve of the legislature, with the exception of the Inland Empire, where 4 in 10 approve. Latinos and Asian Americans are more likely to approve of the legislature than are African Americans and whites. And moving on to approval ratings for Governor Newsom's handling of 2 specific issues. When it comes to how he has handled the coronavirus outbreak, about 7 in 10 adults and likely voters say that they approve. And among partisans, 87% of Democrats and 58% of independents approve, compared to 37% of Republicans. Solid majorities across the state's regions and racial, ethnic, gender, age, education, and income groups say that they approve. Majorities also approve of how Governor Newsom is handling the issue of jobs and the economy, with 59% of adults and 57% of likely voters saying that they approve. Similar to our findings on his handling of the coronavirus, there are strong partisan differences in approval, and majorities across regions and demographic groups say that they approve. Now, taking a look at what Californians say is the top issue facing the state today, this was an open-ended question, and perhaps unsurprisingly, 36% say COVID-19 is the most important issue, and 23% say jobs and the economy is the most important issue. When we last asked this question in September, homelessness and jobs and the economy were tied at 15% each for the top issue. And other issues that had fewer mentions this month include healthcare and health insurance at 6%, housing costs and availability also at 6%, and rounding out the top 5 issues that were mentioned is homelessness at 5%. COVID-19 is the top issue mentioned across all regions in California, followed by jobs and the economy. And the coronavirus is also the top issue mentioned by all partisan and demographic groups. And with the COVID-19 being the most important issue facing the state today, we're now going to take a look at some concerns about and consequences of the pandemic. We asked respondents how concerned they are about getting the coronavirus and requiring hospitalization. And we found that 58% of adults say they are concerned about this, with 24% saying they are very concerned and 34% saying that they are somewhat concerned. At 30% each, African Americans and Californians earning under $40,000 annually are the groups who are most likely to say that they are very concerned about getting the coronavirus and being hospitalized as a result. Californians aged 35 and older are also somewhat more likely to be very concerned than Californians under the age of 35. So unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic has had a negative impact on the lives of so many Californians. And so we asked our respondents about several potential impacts and found that 35% say they or someone in their household has been laid off or lost their job due to the coronavirus. 51% have had their work hours or pay cut, and 27% have reported difficulty paying their rent or mortgage. In addition, 30% of Californians report that they or someone in their household has been laid off and lost their job, and they have had work hours reduced or pay cut, while 43% say that they haven't experienced either of those impacts because of the coronavirus. Californians living in households with annual incomes under $40,000, Latinos, renters, and those without a college degree are the most likely to report a job loss in their household. And across regions, job loss is highest in the Inland Empire. The share of Californians who report that they or someone in their household has experienced reduced hours or pay cuts declines with income and is higher among Latinos and African Americans. Reports of hours being reduced or pay cut declines as education attainment increases and is higher among renters than it is among homeowners. And lastly, Californians earning less than $40,000, Latinos and renters are the most likely to report difficulty in paying their rent or their mortgage. Just a few months ago, as many of you watching probably remember, we were in quite a different situation with the state budget in which there was an estimated multi-billion-dollar budget surplus. But then we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic, and California now faces a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit for the current and next fiscal year. So when asked if they thought the state budget situation was a problem or not, 46% of adults and 52% of likely voters say it is a big problem. Surprisingly, despite the estimated deficit, the share of Californians who think the state budget situation is a big problem is similar to results that we saw in January of this year and also to last May. Republicans are more than twice as likely as Democrats to say that it's a big problem, while half of independents say the same. And this perception increases with rising age and rising income. So now that we've looked at several state issues, we are going to move on to some findings on several national issues. Turning first to the approval ratings for federal elected officials, President Trump's approval rating is 35% among all adults and 33% among likely voters. His approval ratings have remained fairly consistent and were similar both in our February survey and in May of last year. About 8 in 10 Republicans approve compared to 4 in 10 independents and fewer than 1 in 10 Democrats. Across regions, Central Valley residents are the most likely to approve, and among racial ethnic groups, whites are the most likely to approve of the president's job performance. And turning now to Congress, 38% of adults and 31% of likely voters approve of the way that Congress is handling its job, and approval was similar in February, but it was slightly lower 12 months ago. Democrats are more likely than Republicans and independents to approve, and with the exception of residents in Los Angeles, where approval is at 41%, fewer than 4 in 10 across the major regions of the state say that they approve of Congress. Similar to the question we asked about Governor Newsom, we asked respondents whether they approve or disapprove of how President Trump is handling the coronavirus outbreak. And 36% of adults and 34% of likely voters say that they approve, and Republicans are far more likely than independents and Democrats to approve. Across California's major regions, more than 4 in 10 in Orange, San Diego, and the Central Valley approve, compared to fewer elsewhere. And among racial ethnic groups, whites are the most likely to approve of how President Trump is handling the coronavirus outbreak. And as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, more than 40 million Americans have filed for unemployment claims since March. So we asked Californians about the country's financial future and whether they think that the US will experience good or bad economic times over the next 12 months. And we found that 23% think that the US will have good economic times over the next year, while 70% think that we will have bad economic times. There has been a 24-point decline in expectations for good economic times. That was at 47% in November when we last asked this question, down to 23% today. This is the lowest share of Californians who expect good economic times that we have seen since 2009 in the midst of the Great Recession. Today, 4 in 10 Republicans versus 2 in 10 independents and about 1 in 10 Democrats expect good economic times. And fewer than 3 in 10 across regions, racial ethnic groups, and all of the remainder remaining demographic groups anticipate good economic times. Now we are going to turn and examine perceptions about the future of the coronavirus. With over 1.85 million cases of COVID-19 across the country, we asked respondents about where the United States stands in terms of the coronavirus outbreak and whether the worst is behind us or is still yet to come. And Californians are divided on this question, with 46% saying the worst is behind us and 48% saying that the worst is yet to come. Majorities of Republicans and independents say that the worst is behind us, while a majority of Democrats say that the worst is yet to come. At 69%, African Americans are the most likely to say that the worst is yet to come, and at 41%, whites are the least likely to hold this view. The coronavirus pandemic has also brought the US healthcare system to the forefront of the minds of many Americans. And with this in mind, we asked respondents whether they would favor or oppose a national health care plan, sometimes called Medicare for All. Oops, sorry about that. Sometimes called Medicare for All, in which all Americans would get their insurance from a single government plan. And among adults in California, a majority, 62%, say that they favor such a plan, while 35% oppose. And among likely voters, 56% are in favor and 42% are opposed. Democrats are far more likely than Republicans and independents to be in favor, and majorities across the state's major regions say they are in favor. Majorities of African Americans, Asian Americans, and Latinos are in favor, compared to about half of whites. Among those currently covered by a health insurance plan, 62% say that they are in favor, and among those who currently do not have a health insurance plan, 70% say that they are in favor. And with all the events going on in the world today, it's sometimes easy to forget that we are in a presidential election year. And with 5 months to go before the general election, we asked California likely voters who they would vote for president if the election were being held today. And 57% of likely voters said that they would vote for Joe Biden, and 33% said that they would vote for Donald Trump. And very few likely voters are undecided as to who they will vote for president. Partisans are overwhelmingly supporting their party's candidate, but independents are more divided, with 47% saying that they would vote for Biden and 41% saying that they would vote for Trump. Among racial ethnic groups, 72% of Latinos and 68% of likely voters in other racial ethnic groups would support Biden, compared to 49% of whites who support Biden and 40% who support Trump. Majorities across age, education, and income groups support Joe Biden, and women are much more likely than men to say that they support Biden. And one of the major subplots of the 2020 election is whether Democrats will keep control of the House of Representatives. And if the election were being held today, 59% of likely voters say that they would vote for or lean toward the Democratic candidate for the House, while 34% say that they would vote for or lean toward the Republican candidate. Similar to their choice for president, partisans are overwhelmingly supporting their own party's candidate, while independents are once again more divided. The Democratic candidate is preferred by large margins in Los Angeles and in the San Francisco Bay Area, and by narrower margins elsewhere in the state. Among racial ethnic groups, again, we see strong majorities of Latinos and those in other racial ethnic groups supporting the Democratic candidate, while whites are more divided. Democratic candidates are preferred by a 33-point margin in districts that are currently held by Democratic representatives, while Republican candidates are preferred by a 17-point margin in districts held by Republican representatives. And according to the Cook Political Report, there are 7 House districts that are competitive in California in the upcoming election. And in those districts, a slim majority of 52% favors the Democratic candidate over the Republican candidate at 44%. Now, in addition to the findings that I shared today, I wanted to highlight some other key areas and findings that were covered by the survey and that are in the full report, but that we did not cover in the webinar presentation today. And to start, when it comes to restrictions on public activity in their area due to the coronavirus, 28% of Californians think there should be fewer restrictions, 25% think there should be more restrictions, and 46% think that there should be about the same number of restrictions as there are now. In addition, when it comes to state governments lifting coronavirus restrictions, 58% of Californians say that their greater concern is that state governments will lift restrictions too quickly, while 38% say their greater concern is that restrictions will not be lifted quickly enough. And when we ask Californians about their personal financial situation, 45% rate their situation as either excellent or good, 37% say fair, and 18% say poor. Surprisingly, given the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, ratings are nearly identical to responses in our survey from May of last year. We also read respondents a brief summary of Governor Newsom's revised budget plan released a couple of weeks ago. And when asked whether they favor or oppose the plan, Californians are equally divided, with 43% saying that they favor it and 43% saying that they are opposed. And likely voters are similarly divided. Notably, support for the governor's budget fails to eclipse 50% across regions, partisan groups, and age, income, and education groups. Next, we asked Californians about how worried they are about being able to afford the cost of their health care over the next few years, and 2 in 3 say that they are very or somewhat worried about this. Majorities across income groups say that they are worried, while those in lower income groups are the most likely to say that they are very worried. Among those who have health insurance, 63% say that they are very or somewhat worried. And among those without insurance, 83% say this. When we asked respondents how much of the time they can trust the federal government to do what is right, 1 in 4 adults say just about always or most of the time, while more than 7 in 10 say it can be trusted some or none of the time. And these findings for this question were similar when we asked this question in January. And lastly, as I am sure a lot of you know, in response to COVID-19, Governor Newsom recently directed county election officials to send vote-by-mail ballots for the November election to all registered voters in California. And when asked whether this is a good or a bad idea, 73% of likely voters say it is a good idea, while 24% say it is a bad idea. Democrats are much more likely than Republicans and independents to say it is a good idea, and strong majorities across regions and demographic groups say it is a good idea. So at this point, that concludes the presentation slides, but I would like to remind everyone watching to submit any questions or comments that you might have to the email listed on the screen. That's ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. And please remember to include your name and the organization that you're with along with your question. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Mark.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was a really excellent summary of a very important survey. You know, we often say that a survey is, you know, something that is a point in time. And it's always important to remember what that point in time was. Sometimes we call it a snapshot in time. But this particular survey was taken during a 10-day period between May 17th and May 26th. As you know, and as we're all aware, we've been shocked and saddened by the events of May 25th. The death of George Floyd, the circumstances around that death by a police officer, and the rage and frustration and protests that have come after that. And I want to put some of those events of recent days in context by looking at some of our broader public opinion work and looking back and making some comments today. But first, let me start with the snapshot in time that we had in the May survey. Very important time, historic time. One thing that really stands out for me is the broad consensus in California that COVID-19 crisis, the #1 issue, the economy, the #2 issue on Californians' minds. And you can look across regions of the state, political parties that might otherwise disagree on things, demographic groups, and there's broad consensus that these are the first and second most important problems. We had a very different set of most important problems at the beginning of the year or a year ago than we do today, and that's really important to keep in mind. The second thing that stands out for me is the governor's approval ratings. And what do those current approval ratings mean, particularly the increase that we saw in his approval between January and February, but the specifics in terms of his ratings on the COVID crisis and his ratings on the economy today. And to me, what that reflects is that the governor's actions in the past few months have been consistent with or aligned with public preferences in terms of how to handle and how to prioritize the different problems that the state is facing. And that comes through when we talk about the current fears that people have about the COVID crisis and how it might impact their lives, and the extent to which those fears are something that they're thinking about as not just current, but will have future implications. The numbers of people who are saying at this point that the worst might not be behind us. But the consistency between the responses about the state, what people want to happen right now in terms of let's go slowly, let's not act too quick, let's keep what we have in place as opposed to let's loosen restrictions as we go along, suggests that the handling of the public health crisis and the economy and the juggling of those two issues have been done in ways that from the public's perspective right now, reflect in the governor's approval ratings and his specific approval ratings on his handling of the COVID crisis, which are quite high, and the economy, which are certainly good, but the overall improvement in his approval rating since February, when actually he had a record high approval rating of 53%. Next, I think it's really important that we reflect on the perceptions and experiences that Californians who are under different circumstances based upon their race and ethnicity and their income, and how that's reflected in the survey responses having to do with fears about the COVID impacts of the COVID virus, specifically on individuals, and also the amount of problems that have occurred in people's lives, financial problems as a result of the COVID crisis. I ask you to reflect on those findings and what they mean, especially as we look at the experiences of African Americans around the #1 and #2 problem, Latinos, and also Californians who are earning under $40,000. The level of distress, both on the health side and on the economic side, much, much higher in those groups than for Californians who are white, Californians who are in better financial circumstances when this started. And that is, I think, really important to keep in mind as we as we search for solutions and next steps around these, the number 1 and number 2 problems in the state. The other thing I want to point to, and it was a subject of discussion as I went through media interviews yesterday, is the fact that the president and Congress's approval ratings are unchanged between the last time we measured their approval ratings, was in February, similar to the governor and legislature, and today in May. President Trump's approval rating unchanged, and the approval rating of Congress unchanged. And also, we had asked about Californians' trust in the federal government in our January survey, and found just 1 in 4 Californians said that they trust the federal government just about always or most of the time. That didn't change at all either as a result of this crisis, dual and now triple crisis that wasn't measured in this poll, but the dual crisis that we measured, both the COVID and the economy. And what does it mean that approval ratings and trust would be static during a time in which Californians experienced unprecedented health and economic problems at the same time? And it really reflects the level of political polarization that we came into this crisis with, and it's evident in so many of the results in the survey that Californians who support Donald Trump and his actions, and Californians who oppose Donald Trump and his actions have not been changed by anything that's taken place in terms of their overall attitudes. But their attitudes towards the president impact so many different areas outside of politics. Rachel mentioned a couple of areas within politics, which you can see almost identical numbers between the president's approval rating and how people are going to vote for president in the November election, and how people are going to vote for Congress, whether they're going to choose a Republican or Democrat. Very closely associated with President Trump's approval rating. But President Trump's overall approval rating, very similar to the rating that people give for his handling the coronavirus, but also very similar to and very predictive of how people view questions in our survey, or how they respond to questions such as the restrictions on public activity, which Rachel mentioned in her comments, or on the question of whether people think the worst is over or the worst is yet to come in terms of this crisis. So I think that's just very, very important to keep in mind in terms of how people are responding in our survey today, is the degree to which President Trump's approval ratings and support remains unchanged through this crisis, and reflective of other attitudes and policy preferences. Some thoughts about our previous polls, and as well as this one, which, as I mentioned, really highlight the degree of racial disparities, but some other things that in our previous polls that point to what some of the things that we've seen in the last week around the horrific death of George Floyd and by the police, and what we might expect going forward as Californians continue to process this and react to it, and think about what they can do. So I want to point, first of all, and we had a blog post earlier in the week, to some findings we had in our February 2020 survey, just right before the COVID crisis. We asked a question, which we've repeated from other surveys, about attitudes, Californians' attitudes towards the police, and the extent to which Californians believe that the police treat all racial and ethnic groups fairly. And this was a question that was from a national poll of some time ago. And altogether, about 61% of Californians say that just about always or most of the time, they felt the police treat all racial and ethnic groups fairly. But that number was 31%, was half that amount among African Americans in our survey in February. And when we've asked this question before, we've also seen a wide divide in the extent to which African Americans feel that they can trust the police to treat everyone fairly, and the extent to which those other Californians, one can only imagine now how many other Californians are, are now thinking about police differently in terms of fairness, and stay tuned for our future surveys. But there are a few other things that have really given me some guidance in terms of how to think about current events and the level of protests and the type of protests that we've had in the last week. One thing from our November survey, and that was the fact that 63% of Californians said that they view California today as a state in terms of economic conditions of haves and have-nots. And many Californians view themselves as among the have-nots, but even more view the state as a place that where you're either in a category in which you're economically comfortable or you're not. So many of our questions in the last year have pointed to the fact that many Californians feel that there's income inequality in the state, and it's reached a level where it's a serious problem. And I think that to some degree, this is reflected in the level of protests and where the protests have occurred in the last week. From our a survey that we took earlier in 2019, we asked a question which was from a national poll about whether Californians thought that race relations in the US have gotten worse in the past few years. We had asked that question in 2017 and we repeated it. And somewhere around the mid 40s percent of Californians believe that race relations have gotten worse in the last year. But one thing that I noticed in our January survey is that African Americans, more so than any other group, increasingly feel that race relations in the US have gotten worse. That number was 66% in our January 2019 survey. That had increased the most over time, I think reflecting the fact that many Californians are troubled by the direction we are headed in terms of race relations, and in particular, African Americans. So these previous findings, I think, point to some themes that we've seen at work in the last week. First of all, the racial disparities. Secondly, the institutional racism that we saw in the form of the police actions in Minnesota. But I think that when we look at the protests in terms of their multicultural and multi-generational aspects and where those protests occurred, we see that there are a number of Californians who are disturbed about the direction of race relations in the country and the amount of inequality there is amongst our midst, the unevenness of economic conditions. This could have profound impacts on turnout in November in the election. Will this level of activity that we've seen recently become activity that mobilizes some groups more than others to go out to vote? And that could have great meaning in California for what happens in the congressional races. And it could have great meaning throughout the country in terms of states that are where there's close elections, close voter preferences between the Democratic and the Republican candidate. Who turns out to vote will have big meaning for who is elected the next president. So, thank you. So we'd like to go ahead and answer some questions that have already come in via email. So I think Rachel's going to join at this point too. Good. So what do we have in the way of questions that have come in so far? So there was a question that the viewer wanted to know if we could say something about the split roll Prop 13 reform measure on the November 2020 ballot, and whether PPIC has any plans to poll on this in the coming months. Rachel.
Yes, so we actually asked about Prop 13 split roll last month in our Californians in Education survey. And when we asked about it at that time, a very slim majority, 53% of likely voters, said that they would vote yes if the Prop 13 split roll were on the ballot, and 47% said that they would vote no. There are large partisan differences, with Democrats overwhelmingly saying they would vote yes, versus about 2 in 10 Republicans and half of independents. I anticipate as we get closer to the election, we will probably be asking about this again. And Mark, I don't know if you want to expand on that or add anything else.
Yeah, I think that the next time we ask about the split roll, we'll have the benefit of knowing what the ballot title and label are. And that's when, we feel like we can get a much more accurate measure about public opinion on that. But one of the nice things about the Californians and their government series is that we'll take a look at the ballot. We'll choose what seems to be the most important issues. We can't ask about every one of them in terms of the initiatives. But every time we've asked about the split roll, we've kind of gotten, either slight majority support or just under 50%, depending upon how we ask it. We've never seen it in a particularly strong position to date, but we're in a whole different world now. And I think how the ballot title and label are formulated and how people respond to that will be a topic of great interest, especially as the state faces a huge budget deficit, and state and local government will be searching for new ways to fund the services that they very much need. So what do our findings suggest about what people think of the federal government's stimulus during COVID-19 and what it might mean for jobs in the economy? Any thoughts about that?
Well, we didn't ask specifically any questions about the federal stimulus, but I do think there's been a bit of a lift perhaps for the congressional ratings. We've seen them be pretty steady over the past couple months. However, there has been a lift in approval for Congress versus this time last year. So I do think it has had a bit of an impact there. And Mark, I don't know if you had other thoughts about that.
Well, I think this is going to be something that very much comes into play as the state searches for a solution around the budget deficit. And we, as Rachel is well aware, one of the interesting things about doing survey work while you're much of the state under shelter in place is that, first of all, there are a lot of people at home. So that's good for telephone interviews. We found that there was the amount of time that it took to ask the same number of questions was much longer, though. So it was kind of like people got on the phone and then they wanted to stay on the phone with you, and it's like, well, we can't, So we had to make some tough choices about what questions to ask. It would have been really so we. After the budget question, we asked a question about taxes. Do you think that we should, there should be a tax increase in in the state budget plan? And by a 2-to-1 margin, people said no tax increase. It would have been interesting to ask, do you think that the federal stimulus would, be helpful? But I think that it would be pretty likely that we'd have a very high percentage of people saying, yeah, we need that federal stimulus.
Right.
How much it's helped, we can only judge by what people are saying about jobs in the economy now. And there are many, many people, particularly as I mentioned, if we look at the race and income differences in our poll, who are hurting badly in our state now. So it's clear that, you know, while the stimulus may have helped, we've got a lot of economic pain going on right now. So another question was, your research shows Republicans are more ready to, quote, open up the state, end quote, than Dems. Do your crosstabs show any inordinately different views on such by geography?
So in terms of the question about restrictions, I don't believe there are any huge differences, but let me just pull up the crosstabs by region.
While you're pulling up the crosstabs, I'll mention one thing, and that is that, you know, there are many, many counties in California, many rural counties with small populations where we're unable to break out those results. And so if I think about the north, what we call Northern California, north of Sacramento or north of the Bay Area, where there may be many counties that have had relatively few cases, or the Sierra counties, foothill and mountain counties, we're just not able to, you know, get into that level of detail because we don't have a large enough sample size to see if those parts of the state are different. They very well could be, but we're not able to measure that because we don't have enough sample.
Yeah, in terms of the 5 major regions, there are some differences. The shares saying that their greater concern is about lifting the restrictions too quickly is higher in, let's see, the San Francisco Bay Area, 65%, and Orange, San Diego at 63%, versus 59% in the Central Valley, 56% in Los Angeles, 48% in the Inland Empire. And then if we look at the regions who say their greater concern is not lifting the restrictions quickly enough, we have 48% in the Inland Empire, 40% in the Central Valley, 39% in Los Angeles, 34% in Orange, San Diego, and 31% in the San Francisco Bay Area. So there are some regional differences in terms of which of those is a greater concern to the resident.
Yeah. A lot of times regional differences reflect party differences between the different regions. We know that the Bay Area, for instance, is you know, that has the highest proportion of Democrats. Inland areas tend to have more of a split between Republicans and Democrats, and sometimes just the differences in income, but also in this case, differences in what people are experiencing. But just for everybody's reference, all the crosstabs are available for all adults as well as for likely voters on our website. So I appreciate the question from our audience. Okay, so I'm going to ask you, Rachel, when you were in charge of this survey, you were looking at the results when they were coming in every day. What surprised you the most about the survey findings?
Yeah, so there were several things that were surprising this month, but one finding that sticks out to me is that those who say that the state budget situation in California today is a big problem hasn't changed much since we asked that question this January. And it's 46% today who say big problem, and it was 42% in January. Obviously in January, we had the multi-billion-dollar surplus, and now we're facing the multi-billion-dollar deficit as a result of COVID. So it's really interesting to see that the shares.
What did you think it might be? What did you expect it might be instead of?
Well, I think so. The governor released his revised budget plan only a couple days before we went into the field with this survey. So I would anticipate that there's a good portion of people that maybe hadn't heard about it or were unfamiliar, didn't know the specifics, and perhaps our summary for them was the first exposure they were getting with it. So I would expect that maybe as people become more familiar with the revised budget, that we might see that number change somewhat. And also, it was such a drastic change from the January budget. I think it just takes people some time to digest that. So I would say if we ask that question again, we might see some different numbers.
You think we should ask it again?
I think we should.
When do you think the numbers will change?
Well, I know that we, have to have a state budget passed this month. So I would expect it would be getting more press in the news more, and people be more familiar with it by the end of this month. So maybe in July or August, we might see that change.
Okay, so stay tuned. We'll have more results later. I was looking at the chart that you had on seriousness of the state budget situation, and between May 08 and May 12, it was somewhere between 70 and 80% said it was a big problem. It took a long time for that number to come down, even when, the problem wasn't as serious as it was during that time. But I also noticed between 07 and 08, it didn't take very long for that number to go up. So
yeah,
one of those things that it can go up, as soon as people realize that the state budget problem has meaning to them. It's gonna, whether it's schools or their local governments. So,
absolutely.
why is there such split opinion on support of the governor's revised plan? What do you think? 43-43, and this is a governor who is very popular right now.
Right. Again, I think it has something to do with the fact that people may have not had a lot of familiarity with the plan. And obviously the budget is a very detailed thing. I think, when Governor Newsom was laying out his revised plan, it took over an hour and a half, I think, when he was talking about it. And that was a summary version. So we try our best to condense that in the questionnaire. But it is obviously a very short summary. So I think the fact that people maybe just didn't have a lot of familiarity with it, wanted to look into it some more, and based on what we were giving them, had to make a decision then. So Mark, if you have any additional thoughts on that, that would be great.
I think that makes a lot of sense. It's very complicated, a lot to digest for people. They certainly don't like the fact that we're talking about making cuts, but maybe some relief that at this point at least, not asking for tax increase, especially when we found 2-to-1.
Right.
So there was another question about, were we surprised that such a large share thinks that California is generally heading in the right direction, especially given where we are with the economy and COVID? And I just want to say, if from my perspective, that was the one finding that I was most surprised about. There's always one finding where, at least for me, where I feel like I want to go back and, are we sure that we got that right? We don't have it. It's not the other way around,
Right.
That wrong. Did we get wrong direction and right direction mixed up? Because how could 57% think the state is headed in the right direction when so many things are going poorly right now in terms of health and as well as economic crisis that the state is facing? And the thing about the right direction, wrong direction question, which I think is always important to keep in mind, is it's more about the political mood than it is about the economic circumstances. Right. And generally, right direction, wrong direction is tied closely to how people feel about their leadership. And in particular, in this case, the governor's approval ratings right now, in many ways, driving public opinion about whether they feel that the state is generally headed in the right direction. The specific circumstances around California, I think also in terms of the compare and contrast with how people view where the nation leadership is in this crisis and where the state's leadership, that people will be processing that question around, well, California compared to the rest of the nation, then generally heading in the right direction. So there's some of that. Do you have anything you wanted to add?
No, that was, I completely agree. People, Governor Newsom's approval rating is the highest we've seen since he came into office. And they particularly approve of his handling of the coronavirus. So I think people recognize that the economic conditions, are largely a result of the coronavirus outbreak. And like you said, this question is more about the political mood. So with such high approval ratings, it's easy to see why they might think it's going in the right direction.
You can think that the worst is yet to come and still think that we're generally headed in the right direction.
Right.
And in these very unusual times. I'm going to ask you this question, and then I think we're going to close here because I feel like I already answered it in my comments. But based on the recent findings, how do you expect the pandemic and all of its implications to affect the November election in California?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, you touched on this earlier in terms of not only the pandemic, but everything going on in terms of the protests and the movements that are going on, and those impacting especially on the congressional races throughout the state. But another important element that I think will have an impact on the election is the fact that Governor Newsom did issue that executive order about vote by mail, and that all registered voters will receive ballots in the mail. So I think it's quite possible and likely that we might see an increase in participation this time around, which also will likely have an impact on local races and those congressional races that you mentioned.
Yeah, and if all of that energy that we've seen in the last week and a half or so ends up motivating people to vote, it'll be a different, somewhat different electorate this time around. So we'll see how that works. And on that note of the upcoming election, I did want to mention that tomorrow between 11 and 12, we have a special event. Another first of our virtual speakers series on California's future. We're going to have Secretary of State Alex Padilla, and he'll have a lot to say about the election and the census and everything that's going on in our state. We're looking forward to that tomorrow at 11, so stay tuned for that. A big thank you to Rachel for your leadership in managing this survey and also for your presentation today and participation in questions and answers. Thanks again to the funders who made this survey possible. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. And just one last note, if you pre-registered for this event, there's a survey on the way for you. And please, when you receive the survey, take a couple of minutes, that's all it'll take, and send in your responses because we're always trying to make these programs better. So please be safe and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you so much.